Hey 670. So today's lesson is going to be on the major battles and events of the Civil War. In previous lessons, we talked about the causes that led up to the Civil War. And in our last lesson on Tuesday this week, we talked about the North and the South and what really the factors were that divided them and some of their differences in military, transportation, their economy. Now we're going to get more into the major battles and the events that took place during the Civil War. So if you open your lesson for today, the slides that we will be using for this lesson will be right here, major battles and events of the Civil War. If for whatever reason you are not able to access the files, you can email me at, oh, this is a typo. It should be r.dandapani@schools.nysc.gov. I'll fix that and I could send you the necessary files if you're not able to open it. But for right now, let's get right to it. So in this map right here, we have the Confederate States in this orangish color right here, and then we have the Union States in this lighter green, and then this darker green we have the border states. So just a quick review: the Civil War was a war that took place between the North and the South, and these were the Confederate States. These were the Union States in the North. Now, if we look at this red symbol right here, wherever we see that is where the battle sites were. And if you notice, almost all of them, except for a couple up here, which I'll get to later in the lesson, pretty much all of them took place in Confederate States. And if we recall from the previous lesson, we learned that this war was a defensive war for the Confederate States, meaning they were fighting the battles on their own territory. And for the Union States, it was an offensive war, meaning they had to go into their territory, into the Union States, into the Confederate States territory to fight. So it was a defensive war for the Confederate States and an offensive war for the Union States. So, Fort Sumter. This was the date that the war began on April 12th, 1861. We were briefly introduced to this the previous lesson, and this took place in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. So, after an attempt was made by Union ships to resupply this Union held fort, the South fired upon the fort. So, due to the fort's location in the South, the people of South Carolina they asserted, meaning um, they really tried to let them know that the fort was theirs. So this was a 33-hour long battle. So what happened? The Union held fort. It fell to the Confederate forces. So basically, they were battling over this territory, right? Because if you look back, um, South Carolina Fort Sumter was right here, right? And the Union lost this battle. All right, the firing on Fort Sumter off the coast of South Carolina, this officially began the Civil War. So the Confederacy was the winner of this battle. Now we have the first battle of Manassas, the Bull Run. This one took place on July 21st, 1861, and it was near Manassas, Virginia. So President Lincoln sent, this was the cause, President Lincoln sent Union forces to attack and defeat the Confederate Army near Manassas. He also planned to have the Union Army capture the Confederate capital of Richmond and hoped to quickly end the war. So, what happened as an effect? The Union was forced to retreat and they were unable to capture Richmond in Virginia. This was what would be known as the first major battle of the Civil War. And the war would continue after that. So, once again, the Confederacy won this battle as well. So, as you can see in the very beginning, the Confederate States were winning those battles. Next, we have the Battle of the Hampton Roads, which took place in 1862. This one was in Chesapeake Bay, Virginia, and the CSS Virginia met with USS Monitor, and the ships fired cannonballs at each other for hours. So this wasn't exactly a major battle, right? But this this would change naval warfare and the way that wooden ships were used. And instead of using wooden ships, they would start using metal ships. So there wasn't a real winner in this battle. So both ships basically left the area. It would just change the way the war would be fought. Then we have the Battle of Antietam. So this was in also the same year, later on in the year, near Sharpsburg, Maryland. So after several Union losses in the battle, Confederate General Robert E. Lee, he saw an opportunity to invade the North. So they were thinking, we're winning all these battles, we're gonna try to go into their territory. So going back to the map, remember how we saw how there were some battles in the North? Here was the Battle of Antietam, right? It was actually in border state territory. And as you can see, there are a couple other battles in Union states. So Robert E. Lee, who led the Confederate Army, he was a Confederate general. He said, okay, we're going to invade their territory since we're winning these battles. So the two sides, they met at Antietam Creek, and they fought each other all day. Neither side gained any ground, but by nightfall, 23,000 men were wounded or dead. So this was the single bloodiest day of the Civil War. So there wasn't a winner in this battle, but the Confederate Army retreated, which is important. They backed out of their territory, and then President Lincoln, he used this as an opportunity to change the focus of the war. So he would issue an order, and that order was the Emancipation Proclamation. So after that battle of Antietam, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It was a law that declared that all slaves would be permanently freed in all areas of the Confederacy. So remember, the areas of the Confederacy are these southern states. So he declared that all slaves in these states would be permanently freed. And so it says officially all slaves would be permanently freed in all areas of the Confederacy that had not already returned to federal control by January 1863. But this did not include the Union states, right, in these states, or the border states, this lighter blue, right? Now, if you think about how this is important, you'll see why in the next slide. It would change the focus of the war to freeing slaves, right? That's what President Lincoln wanted to do. And what happened as a result? Many of those freed slaves would join the Union Army. So the Union Army ended up getting a lot bigger after that. So the 54th Massachusetts Infantry was the first African American volunteer unit to join the fight after that proclamation was issued. So it made the North Army a lot stronger. Then we have the Battle of Gettysburg. This took place from July 1st to the 3rd on 1863. And this was in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So Confederate General Robert E. Lee, he wanted to bring the war out of the South and into the North. So the Union and the Confederate armies met and battled for 3 days. So once again, this is a battle that took place not in a Confederate state, but in a Union state, right? Robert E. Lee, he wanted to bring the war out of the South and into the North Territory. So the Union, they were able to fight off the Confederacy's last attempt at a northern invasion. And this was a huge turning point of the war. The Union won this battle, and this would be a huge turning point because from here, everything would go uphill for the Union states. So after 4 months after that battle, the Battle of Gettysburg on the 19th of November, 1863, President Lincoln issued a 2-minute speech, and he was quoted. He said, "The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." So his speech basically reminded the Union troops and everyone in the North that they were fighting to save the Union and for democracy, right? Because ultimately that was what they wanted. Remember back in Unit 2 where they gained independence from the British. They had their own democracy rather than being ruled by a monarch, a king, right? And then we have the Battle of Vicksburg. This took place on July 4th, 1863. So this took place over many months before the city was taken. And it was in Vicksburg, Mississippi. So the Union wanted to gain control of the Mississippi River. The Union surrounded and bombed this last remaining port city. So the Confederate city fell to Union forces, and the South was split in half, and that gave the Union control of the Mississippi River. So the Union won this battle. And then we have Sherman's March to the Sea. This battle took place on November 15th to December 21st. And they marched through Atlanta, from Georgia to Savannah. And General Sherman, he led his men in a battle strategy known as total war. So what they did is basically they just burned everything in the South. They burned buildings, bridges, and railroads. They burned and destroyed all those things, and that was what would force the South to surrender in this war. And the Union was the winner. So ultimately, the surrender took place at the Appomattox Courthouse. The date the war officially ended was on April 9th, 1865. So it took place in the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia in the home of Wilmer McLean. So Robert E. Lee and his Confederate troops, they flee, but they're caught at Appomattox Courthouse. So he realized he must surrender. So Lee made his famous quote, "I would rather die 1,000 deaths." So Robert E. Lee surrenders to the Union General Ulysses S. Grant at the home of Wilmer McLean, and the war officially ends. And the Union wins the war. And this is a huge reason why, to this day, that all those states in the South, they're a part of our country now, right? These are no longer the Confederate States. They are part of our country. Remember going back to the previous lesson, how they had their own government, and the capital was in Richmond, Virginia. Now this is all one country, right? So let's go to the assessments and quickly review what is assigned for this lesson. So we have classwork, and the classwork is a set of 5 questions which are all based on the slides that we just reviewed. And then we have an exit ticket. We have an exit ticket, which is also based on the slides. And then the homework, you're going to watch this YouTube video right here, and you're going to answer a question on that, and that is going to be due Tuesday of next week. All right? Ignore this right here. I'm going to change that. Instead of an article, I'm going to remove this. You're going to do the homework based on the video. All right? And I'll post the question and assessments. All right? And that is all for today.